5 times a day, every day, over 1 billion Muslims bow down and recite a prayer to Allah, given to them by Muhammad, their prophet. Every day, 5 times a day, they face a black rock in the holy city of Mecca and submit themselves afresh to the religion of Islam. Every day, they bow as a corporate group all around the world to express their solidarity as followers of Islam, for whom Muhammad is their prophet, the Quran is their scripture, and Mecca is their holy city. However, as archaeological discoveries are beginning to point to a different story, scholars are seriously examining and challenging the facts about the founding of Islam. And if they're right, how will it affect Muslims today? We have tools at our disposal that have never been available before. Modern technology is allowing us to reconstruct the opening years of Islam and to understand things that have puzzled historians for years. All over the world, universities, museums, and libraries are putting ancient books and writings on the internet for scholars to access. Now we can check these ancient manuscripts with just a few clicks of a mouse. Today, both academics and amateurs alike can accurately check via satellite locations and details that would previously have taken huge expense and effort, and can share them instantly around the world via social media and academic forums. So, now for the very first time, a whole new era of research surrounding the founding of Islam is coming to light, and we can piece together what really happened in Arabia 1500 years ago. Writer and historian Dan Gibson has lived most of his life in the Middle East. He has extensively researched the peoples and places of the ancient world before Islam.
I first came to Arabia in my early 20s, and I've spent more than 30 years exploring every corner of this amazing part of the world, piecing together evidence for a radical new theory, which I believe will change our understanding of the past. Years of study have led me to the conclusion that Islam began somewhere other than where the conventional histories suppose, and that in early Islamic writings there are clues and references that reveal the hidden truth about the Mecca mystery. Back in 2002, I had occasion to visit a conference on Nabatean studies organized here by the Al Hussein bin Talal University. During the conference, I had occasion to speak with leading archaeologists from Saudi Arabia and from Jordan. I asked them specifically about the archaeological record in Mecca. While not wishing to be named or quoted, they admitted that there was no archaeological record in Mecca before 800 AD. I had expected them to defend the opinion that Mecca was a walled city with houses and gardens and public buildings and temples. They said no, there was nothing like that there. Did you know that the name Mecca is mentioned only once in the whole Quran? Muslim scholars link other names with Mecca. Names such as the Forbidden Gathering Place, or the Holy House, or the Place of Becca, or Weeping. All of these terms are universally associated with Mecca today. Nevertheless, the Quran itself does not tell us in so many words that these all refer to Mecca. Muslim scholars see no reason to debate this. But in recent years, some historians have raised questions. They have noted that Mecca was a barren place and not located on the ancient caravan route. People have imagined that the caravans carried incense, spice, and other exotic goods. But according to recent research, by the time of Muhammad, the age of frankincense was now long over, and the Arabs engaged in a trade of leather and clothing, hardly items that could have sustained a large city that was described as the mother of all cities and the center of the trade route. Look at this map. Where do all of the trade routes intersect? There are 3 places in northern Arabia that could be described as the center of the trade route. What is interesting is that Mecca was not even a stopping place because it was not even located on the caravan route.
In this film, we will find out why there is a total lack of archaeology in Mecca from the time of the Prophet Muhammad. why descriptions of Mecca do not tally with the landscape, and how an early Islamic civil war altered the truth about Islam. While Muslims all over the world believed that their holy city and their founding leaders all lived in Mecca, in Saudi Arabia, Dan Gibson believes the evidence actually points elsewhere.
During my studies of Arabian history, I've come across evidence that points not to Mecca, but to northern Arabia as the founding place of Islam. Up until now, no one has ever questioned that Mecca is the holy city of Islam. Every Muslim believes that he should pray towards the Black Rock in Mecca. But years of study and countless trips to all parts of the Arabian Peninsula have led me to a radical new understanding of Islamic history. I believe that in the process of understanding Islamic history, a fundamental error has been made. It wasn't a deliberate falsehood, it was just a misunderstanding of what happened during the founding years of Islam. So later Islamic writers corrected what they thought was an error in earlier histories when it was actually the truth.
Is it possible that over 1 billion people who follow the religion of Islam misunderstand how and where their religion began? And if so, what implications does this evidence have for the average Muslim who wants to follow the instructions of Muhammad, his prophet? We are going to have to examine a time in history and a setting that few of us understand. For centuries, the histories of the classical world and Middle East empires have been discussed, but little effort has been given to the history of Arabia. This ignorance is true not just of the West, but also of the Arabs themselves.
The Prophet Muhammad was born in 570 AD, at a time and a place that few people today really know about. His grandfather and his father were Nabatean merchants, and in fact Muhammad himself married a merchant woman. One day, Muhammad was meditating in a cave and an angel visited him. The angel taught him words of praise to Allah. Later, his wife convinced Muhammad that it really had been an angel and he was in fact called to be a prophet of God. During his lifetime, he had many visits from the same angel, and each time there was a new revelation. These revelations from the whole of the lifetime of Muhammad become gathered together to what we know today as the Quran.
Adel Ishamari studied Islam at the Islamic College in Kuwait. Over the years, he and Dan have formed a good friendship and have often found themselves drawn into deep discussion about faith and its history.
كانت رسالة محمد هي أن في إله واحد وأن هو آخر الأنبياء الذي أرسلهم الله. وهذا الشيء أغضب كثير من المتواجدين في مكة بسبب أنهم كانوا يعبدون آلهة أخرى وهي الأصنام. كثير من الأصنام كان موجود هناك وكانوا يعبدون هذه الآلهة. ولهذا السبب بسبب غضب الناس عليهم صار اضطهاد على محمد وعلى القلة من أتباعه. فقرر محمد وأتباعه الهجرة إلى المدينة.
Muhammad and his followers suffered persecution. So he and a few of his followers fled to Medina. Now that city actually converted to Islam and Muhammad established a government there. And in fact, we can date the Muslim calendar from this period of time. Shortly after this, his followers started attacking caravans, growing in power, growing in number, until eventually more and more people joined them, to the point where they became an expanded military presence, in fact, throughout the whole of Arabia. Muhammad gave his vision of taking Islam to the entire world. However, he died unexpectedly. And at that point, disputes broke out, leading to civil wars. But despite these differences and these divisions, there was the continued dream of expanding the faith to the whole of the world. Eventually, much of North Africa and Central Asia became under the control of Islam. And today, Islam is the second largest of the world's religions.
Today, all over the Middle East, when construction companies want to dig for a foundation, there should be someone present from the Ministry of Antiquities. It doesn't matter if you're in Jerusalem, Damascus, or Amman, Jordan. Wherever you dig, the chances are you will expose an ancient site of some sort. In the city of Mecca, in Saudi Arabia, developers are digging all over. putting up great buildings, hotels and high-rises. But, to the surprise of archaeologists, there are no ruins of a great and ancient city under Mecca. The city where Muhammad was born was a major city. It had no trouble in raising large numbers of men to work caravans and march in its armies. Not only did it have a significant population, but it was also an agricultural city.
وتسمى هذه المدينة اللي هي مكة بأم القرى في القرآن. أم القرى هي الاسم هذا المفروض يطلق على مدينة مبهرة، مدينة فيها آثار، مدينة فيها ليها أسوار، مدينة يعني كبيرة معروفة.
The Prophet Muhammad would go forth for his affairs and journey far afield until he reached the glens of Mecca and the beds of its valleys. Aisha, Muhammad's wife, mentioned how one of the men was longing for Mecca. Would that I but stay overnight in a valley filled with various kinds of grass? When we came to Mecca, we saw a town blessed with water and trees, and delighted with it, we settled there. Al-Bukhari speaks of a prisoner who was eating grapes while he was chained in irons, and he says, "This was not the time of fruit in Mecca."
It's hard to believe that these things were written about Mecca. The area around Mecca is all rocks and desert. Mecca averages less than 10 centimeters of rain per year. With its extremely hot temperatures and barren conditions, this is scarcely enough to grow any vegetation at all, let alone grow enough food to support a large population. Yet the holy city of Islam is described as having fields with trees and grass and soil. But there's no cultivatable land near Mecca. It doesn't match the ancient descriptions. Ibn Ishaq mentions that the people of Mecca were reluctant to cut down trees in the sacred area. The presence of trees and plants in ancient times can be easily tested by the presence of spores and pollen in undisturbed ancient soil. To date, there is no record of trees having ever existed in ancient Mecca.
Another puzzle is that the city of Mecca is missing on all early maps of Arabia. One would expect that a major merchant city would be mentioned on early maps, but not one shows Mecca before the time of Islam.
Over the years, I have gathered copies of many ancient maps of Arabia. I have diligently translated them, but never once did I find Mecca mentioned on a map before Islam. Did you know that the name Mecca does not appear in any literature prior to 740 AD? That's 120 years after the founding of Islam. Don't you find it puzzling that for the first 120 years of Islamic history, none of the surrounding nations knew anything about the existence of Mecca?
How could a major city, a city that could raise thousands of men in its army, a city that had agriculture, trees, grass, fruit and grapes, be missed by other nations? How could a major city with walls, temples, and public buildings not be found in the annals of other nations, especially if it was a merchant city that undertook trade with all the nations around it? And most puzzling of all is that when we go to the physical location of this ancient city, we find that there is no early archaeological record. It was an insignificant location, not even on a trade route. Many historians today have come to the conclusion that the accounts of the founding of Islam are all myths. Obviously, there is a great discrepancy between what Islamic records tell us and what the archaeologists have been finding, so the conclusion they draw is that the Islamic records are just fabricated myths.
In my years of study, I have become convinced that the early records are not myths, but that they refer to another location that fits all of these descriptions. I believe that Muhammad was born and raised in another place, and that Muslims are facing the wrong direction when they pray. According to commonly accepted Islamic history, the Kaaba was a major shrine in the city of Mecca and the focus of pilgrimage in Arabia. A good starting place might be studying the pilgrimage before the founding of Islam.
وكما دون المؤرخ الطبري بأن هناك كان نوعان من الحج، الحج والعمرة. الحج الأكبر أو الحج الأصغر، وكان جد محمد كان يؤدي العمرة قبل الإسلام.
This Umrah before Muhammad was at a time when the focal point of Arabian pilgrimage was to a place known as the Forbidden Gathering Place. This location held many pagan idols.
وهذه الأسماء كانت موجودة قبل الإسلام، ولكن ما زال المسلمين إلى حد هذا الآن يستخدمون نفس الأسماء، ولكن هي الأسماء هذه إيتنا من الخارج، يعني من الوثنية، ليس أسماء إسلامية.
In order for us to understand what was happening in pre-Islamic Arabia, we need to understand the importance of holy places in ancient Arabia. From ancient times, Middle Eastern religions have equated gods with regions rather than being universal. Modern readers of history have long been influenced by Greek and Roman concepts of the pantheon of gods and have failed to realize the significance that the ancient Arabs applied to gods of specific regions. In the eyes of the ancient Arabs, there were gods who lived in Mesopotamia, gods who lived in Egypt, and gods who lived in Greece, and so on. Arab merchants passing through an area would respect the local gods. They were not opposed to gods of different places. What they were opposed to was the representation of a god in human or animal form. They preferred to use geometric shapes. For instance, here is a god in the shape of a block. That one over there is shaped as a triangle. Each of these gods were considered local gods and must be respected when passing through their territory.
Such a view of religion naturally leads to accepting territories and locations as being sacred to specific gods. Thus, the area around a temple, such as a particular valley or remote desert location, could be considered as sacred. It would have a precinct where people could gather, even with their enemies, and be safe, because violence was forbidden in the sacred precincts.
When tourists enter the majestic beauty of Wadi Rum here in southern Jordan, they're so often taken up with the exquisite beauty of this valley and the rugged mountains that they miss a temple dedicated to the goddess Lat, or Allat as some call her. This Nabatean temple had a sacred area. It was located in front of the temple, with the mountains marking off the sacred area.
Before Islam, Arabs were divided into many groups. They worshipped different gods and often fought amongst themselves over tribal issues. The one thing that held them together was the pilgrimage to a common ancient meeting place. The Quran calls this Masjid al-Haram, or the Forbidden Gathering Place. Masjid means gathering and is translated mosque today. Before Islam, there were no mosques, so the masjid was simply a gathering place. The Forbidden Gathering Place was a sacred place of refuge and security, where regular activities ceased and violence was forbidden, or haram. The concept of haram, or forbidden, is very strong in Islam.
في القرآن ذكر المسجد الحرام، وهو المسجد الحرام في المدينة الإسلامية المقدسة، ويعتبر المسجد الحرام وما حواليه من المدن هو منطقة محرمة.
Allah has made Mecca a sacred sanctuary, and it was a sanctuary before and will be so after. None is allowed to uproot its shrubs or cut its trees or hunt its game.
So we have two descriptions of the original holy city of Islam. It was a haram place where killing was forbidden, and it was the focus of the pilgrimage for many centuries before the founding of Islam. Now look here, much of the graffiti found throughout the Negev and southern Jordan was written by people on pilgrimage to the ancient city of Petra in southern Jordan. Thousands of people scratched their names and messages on rocks as they made their way to Petra for pilgrimage. This creates a problem for us. Mecca is unknown in maps and literature before and during the rise of Islam. The descriptions, such as the center of the trade route, the mother of all cities, and the focal point of the ancient pilgrimage, do not fit. How can we solve this? The answer to that comes from Islam itself.
المساجد في الوقت الحاضر تتجه كلها صوب القبلة، صوب الكعبة، وهناك مكان في المسجد يسمى المحراب الذي الإمام يوقف فيه ويصلي ويقود المصلين، ولكن في الأيام الماضية ما كان موجود هذا المحراب، ولكن كان في حائط يتجه صوب القبلة، وكان المبنى بالكامل مبني باتجاه صوب القبلة.
In Islam, it is universally understood that the Qibla is towards Mecca in Saudi Arabia. No one questions the direction of the Qibla today. However, the Quran tells Muslims they have a Qibla. The text of the Quran does not give the name of the city to which prayer was originally made. It only mentions Masjid al-Haram, or the forbidden gathering place. Muslims believe they originally prayed towards Jerusalem. According to Islamic sources, in 624 AD, Muhammad changed the Qibla to Mecca. Muhammad revealed this in Surah 2 of the Quran.
Thus we appointed the Qibla to you. Indeed, it was a momentous change, except to those guided by Allah. Allah would never make your faith of no effect. Now, shall we turn you to a Qibla that shall please you? Turn then your face in the direction of the Masjid al-Haram. Wherever you are, turn your faces in that direction.
As a historian of the Arabian Peninsula, I've always been interested in finding the location of the original Qibla. What direction did Muhammad pray towards before the Qibla was changed? Was it Jerusalem, as some claim? Was it Syria, as some claim? Or was it some other direction?
If we were to do this study 100 years ago, it would require an incredible amount of work and research. We would have to travel the world searching ancient sites to find the earliest mosques in Islam. Now, in a few moments, we can do what used to take a lifetime. Google Earth lets us look down on sites from space, and websites like ArcNet can combine the research of hundreds of students and professors. We can examine structures based on various criteria. We choose Islamic buildings, arrange them by date into a chronological list, then determine when they were constructed, check their Qibla direction by using Google Earth, and collate this to determine when the Qibla direction changed towards Mecca. This will give us solid data to work with.
Now, determining the Qibla direction is not an exact science. Some of the early mosques, like this one, are not exactly square. So researchers need to find the Qibla wall and project 90 degrees from that wall. Because early buildings were not square, we cannot use the side walls or the back walls. This is the mihrab of an old mosque. The early Arabs set the Qibla direction using the stars, and they were very accurate. The best way to determine the Qibla direction is to visit the mosque and use an actual accurate GPS unit. Not every mosque can be used for this study. Many of them were totally reconstructed over time, so much so that it is no longer possible to determine their original Qibla direction. However, a number of mosques survive. For instance, there is a mosque called the Mosque of the Two Qiblas in Medina. Islamic history tells us that it was in this very mosque that the companion leading prayers was told of the Qibla change. So he turned around and started praying towards Mecca. The question is, where did he originally face? Muslims have a ready answer. He prayed towards Jerusalem. Now today, the Mosque of the Two Qiblas faces Mecca. But in 1987, the mosque was completely torn down so it could be rebuilt. During the construction process, the old foundation was revealed, and they discovered that it did have a Qibla wall that did indeed face north, generally towards Jerusalem. And so Muslims believe originally the Qibla was towards Jerusalem.
There is a simple way that this can be put to the test. If we go to the earliest mosques that were built, where we can identify their direction of prayer, we can plot them on a map and see if their lines converge. We'll find one of three things. They all point in different directions. They all point to Jerusalem, or they all point to another location. After the Mosque of the Two Qiblas in Saudi Arabia, there are a further 11 early surviving mosques that we can research. These are located in China, Egypt, southern Jordan, Lebanon, Central Jordan, Yemen, Israel, Iraq, Jerusalem, West Bank, and lastly Lebanon. So, if we go in the order that they were built, the second surviving mosque was built in Guangzhou, China. Guangzhou is the modern name for what was known as the city of Canton.
When Marco Polo reached this city in 1300 AD, he discovered over 100,000 Arab and Persian merchants living there. You see, the Arabs had been trading with the Chinese for hundreds and hundreds of years. This is all well documented. And so Abu Waqas, an uncle of Muhammad, traveled to China on a trade mission. And according to Chinese manuscripts, he built a mosque for the Arabs in Canton in 627 AD, or 6 years after the founding of Islam. I personally examined this mosque and used a GPS unit to determine the mosque's Qibla direction. What I found was surprising. This mosque does not face Mecca. It faces 12 degrees north of Mecca, meaning that it does not face Jerusalem either. Its Qibla passes south of Jerusalem.
The next mosque was built in 641 AD, about 20 years after the founding of Islam, in the town of Fustat, just outside of Cairo.
This mosque was rebuilt and enlarged several times, so that today the original foundation is no longer evident. However, a description of the original ground plan of the mosque survives, and the Islamic records tell us that the first Qibla pointed east and later had to be corrected towards the south, towards Mecca.
The next surviving Islamic building is the Umayyad Palace, built here at Humayma in southern Jordan.
Around 700 AD, or about 80 years after the founding of Islam, the Abbas family built a large manor house here. This house had no special mosque area. Rather, the faithful would line up here in the courtyard to pray. This house has a Qibla direction, but it is not towards Jerusalem.
The following year, a new mosque was built in Baalbek in Lebanon. Notice that its Qibla does not point to Mecca.
1 year later, the Umayyads built a large and impressive mosque here on the citadel in Amman, Jordan. This mosque points south. Mecca is over there.
A couple of years after this, in 705 AD, or 84 years after the founding of Islam, Muslims constructed the Great Mosque of Sana'a in the capital city of Yemen. While this mosque points in the general direction of Mecca, it actually points to the west of Jerusalem.
The following year, in 706 AD, the Umayyad Muslim rulers built Khirbat al-Minya, a large palace complex in Israel on the shores of Galilee. This palace complex had a specific room used as a mosque. According to the inscription set into a gateway, it was built 87 years after the founding of Islam by the Muslim ruler Al-Walid. This building and its mosque do not face Jerusalem. That same year, the Muslims also built the Wasit Mosque in Iraq. Originally, archaeologists claimed that this mosque pointed to Jerusalem. However, further research has shown that this mosque points south of Jerusalem.
The next mosque is the Al-Aqsa Mosque in Jerusalem itself. This mosque is not the temple dome, but rather the old mosque to the south of the dome. This mosque is already in Jerusalem, but it also has a Qibla, and it does not point to Mecca. The next mosque we come to was built in 724 AD, 103 years after the founding of Islam. This is the Khirbat al-Mafja Mosque near Jericho in the Jordan Valley. This palace was built near the end of the Umayyad dynasty. By looking at the floor plan, we can see that the palace and its mosque faced south rather than towards Mecca. That same year, a mosque was built at Anjar, about 58 kilometers from Beirut. It was built near the end of the Umayyad period, and no more than 30 years later, it fell into ruins and eventually was abandoned. Since it was never rebuilt, we can easily determine the Qibla direction, which does not point towards Mecca, or Jerusalem. Now, let's put this all together onto one map. The result is amazing. During the first 100 years of Islam, 100% of all the surviving mosques we have located so far face a spot in southern Jordan rather than Mecca. From north, south, east and west, mosques all face towards one spot. This isn't some small error in determining the Qibla direction. They all specifically point to just one place.
Directly under this point is the ancient city of Petra. This is a city that is well known to us today. It is a popular tourist site. Tourists come from all over the world to marvel at the great temples and the monuments in this city. Could it be that Petra is the mother of all cities described in the Quran? It was the focus of the ancient Arab pilgrimage. So could Petra also be the birthplace of Muhammad and the founding city of Islam?
دان غريب، يعني أنت تقول إن البتراء لكن البخاري يقول لنا هي القدس، فشلون تبي نفكر في هذا الأمر؟ شلون تبينا نقبل هذا الشيء؟ يعني البخاري قال لنا القدس.
Every good Muslim tells me that Muslims used to pray towards Jerusalem. They know this because Bukhari tells them this. And I agree, Bukhari says it was Jerusalem. But Bukhari is writing some 200 years after Muhammad, and he's writing more than 100 years after the Qibla change took place. So he's not an eyewitness. He's just collecting what people are remembering. And he actually notes several conflicting ideas that were circulating at the time.
While some people were offering morning prayer at Quba, a man came to them and said, "A Quranic order has been revealed to Allah's apostle tonight, that he should face the Kaaba at Mecca. So you too should turn your faces towards it." At that moment, their faces were towards Syria. And on hearing this, they turned towards the Kaaba at Mecca.
I believe that originally Muhammad, while living in Medina, prayed north towards Petra, which was in the Roman province of Syria. By the time Bukhari was collecting his stories, people had forgotten Petra, and everyone remembered that their great-grandparents prayed towards Syria.
دان القرآن يقول لنا مسجد الحرام في بكة، فيا ترى بكة وين موقعها الحقيقي؟
Those who bring up the argument about Becca raise an interesting point. I agree that in Islamic literature, the name Becca is synonymous with the first holy city of Islam. When Muhammad was a young man, the people decided to rebuild the Kaaba. In the rubble, they found several building blocks with inscriptions written in Syriac, the language of the Nabateans. They found a Jew who could translate it for them.
I am Allah, the Lord of Bika. I created it on the day that I created heaven and earth, and formed the sun and moon, and I surrounded it with 7 pious angels. It will stand whilst its 2 mountains stand, as a blessing to its people with milk and water.
The word Becca is an ancient Semitic word which means to weep or lament. If a location was assigned the title Becca, it would mean the place of weeping. The name Becca has never been used of Jerusalem. It appears only once in the Bible in Psalm 84. Here it is used in reference to a valley of weeping. But the Quran also speaks of a valley of weeping, where Hagar was weeping over Ishmael. The Quran places this story in Becca, which is the early name for the place where the Kaaba was built. Surely this location was not Jerusalem, which is built on top of a mountain and not in a valley. I think the answer is quite simple. There were many major earthquakes in Petra, such as the one in 551 AD, only 19 years before Muhammad was born. We are told that during that earthquake, much of Petra was destroyed. Petra could have been called the Valley of Becca because so many people were killed over so many years from all the earthquakes.
If Petra is the holy city of Islam, then there should be evidence of Muhammad's tribe, the Quraysh, around Petra. If Dan Gibson can find Muhammad's tribe, it will greatly support his theory that Muhammad was from the Petra region and not from Mecca.
Long ago, this was known as the city of Hawar, or Humayma as it is known today. Archaeologists have uncovered a farmhouse belonging to the Abbasid family and a mosque built some time later. When the Muslims of Iraq defeated the Umayyads of Damascus, they wanted a member of Muhammad's family to support and legitimize their revolt. And so they came here to Humayma, 27 miles from Petra. It was here that they found Muhammad's family and the Quraysh tribe. They didn't go to Mecca in Saudi Arabia or Medina. They came here to Humayma, 27 miles outside of Petra. It was here that they found the Quraysh tribe and the family of Muhammad, not in Saudi Arabia.
So far, we have discovered that the early mosques of Islam all faced the ancient city of Petra. But does the city of Petra fit the Islamic descriptions of the original holy city of Islam?
There is a story told by all of the early biographers of Muhammad. It concerns Abdullah, Muhammad's father. He was working in the field one day and he came home with dirt on his hands. He went in to his first wife and said, "Lie with me," but she refused because he was dirty. So he went out, washed off the soil, went into his next wife, Amanah. She conceived, and in this way, Muhammad was born. What is important to us about this story is that all of the early writers use the same word for the dirt on Abdullah's hands. They all use an Arabic word for soil, especially the soil of a cultivated plot or field. The problem is, there is no cultivatable land near Mecca. However, when we come to Petra, we discover that Petra had water, fields, and trees.
According to archaeologists, there were private and public gardens, as well as running water brought into the city through aqueducts and clay pipes. Archaeologists have described fruit trees, grapes, and gardens existing in ancient Petra. Even today, there are cultivated plots of land between Petra and El Beida, which is 5 kilometers away. By analyzing ancient soil, researchers have discovered that only 100 years ago, the hills around Petra were covered with trees, including oak, juniper, pistachio, and carob.
Not only did the holy city have trees and fields, it was also a walled city. Ibn Ishaq says, and they surrounded him by the walls of Mecca. Now this is very puzzling because Mecca had no city walls. Some think perhaps this was a house in Mecca, but Ibn Ishaq specifically says the walls of Mecca. But Mecca was not a walled city. So what about Petra? Petra was built in a valley. On either side of the valley were large mountains with cliffs. These cliffs were as good as city walls. So the people of Petra built walls from one mountain cliff to the other mountain cliff, both on this side of the valley and also on the other side of the valley. So Petra had city walls. Another distinctive feature in Petra is that it contains a very unique stream. Now, usually you have a valley with mountains on one side, mountains on the other, and a stream running down the center of the valley. But in this case, long ago, earthquakes cracked these mountains so that there is a crack in that mountain, water runs through that crack, across the valley, and out the crack in the other side. The Nabateans built a colonnaded street from one mountain to the other mountain, and beside it was a rainwater course. Let's go down there. Now, in Islam, one of the duties of the pilgrims is to go 7 times between 2 mountains called Marwa and Safa. What is interesting is that Bukhari tells us that Muhammad chose to do this, running in the rainwater course between the 2 mountains. But there are problems. Safa and Marwa are just small rocks. Today, they're housed right inside of the mosque building. As you can see on this drawing, there was no rainwater course between these two rocks. But here in Petra, the description fits exactly from one mountain to the other. There are 4 ways into the Petra Basin. Since Petra is in a valley, one could enter from either end of the valley.
During the year of the contest of Mecca, the Prophet entered Mecca through its upper part.
But there were also other ways of entering Petra. The ancient records tell us that the holy city could be entered and exited by a crack in the rocks. In Arabic, this is called a thaniya. Al-Bukhari mentions this several times.
Allah's apostle used to enter Mecca from the high Thaniya and used to leave Mecca from the low Thaniya. The Prophet went on advancing till he reached the Thaniya through which one would go to them, that is, the people of Quraysh.
There are 2 thaniya entrances. One of these is the famous Sikh that tourists pass through to enter the city. The other is on the far side of the colonnaded street and leads into a maze of canyons that eventually empty out into Wadi Araba below the Dead Sea. Petra also has many temples. Over here is what is known today as the Temple of the Winged Lions, or the Temple to Al-Uzza. Behind me is what is known as Qasr al-Bint today, or the temple to the god Dushera. This short chain of mountains here was the home to the god, and here in the very heart of the mountains is the temple to this god, El-Dushera.
Now, Ibn Hisham relates to us a very interesting story. It's very early in Islamic history. Only a few people have converted to Islam at this time. One of those was a man known as Al-Tufail bin Amr of Mecca. He accepted Islam on one of his journeys, and once he returned home to Mecca, his wife also